Okay, welcome to Backlog Grooming for Sprint 22 during Sprint 22. Thank you all for your patience as we set up a proper invite and proper recording session for this. Just for the minutes, I suppose, I think we can say we have in attendance right now me, James Zetlin, Jimmy Sanford from the core team, Rowan Meerwood from Google, James Kalkoben from the core team, and Artyom Kozanets from Comrade. Alexander Leeson let me know that he's going to be on vacation, which I assume he richly deserves. And let's hope that more attendees show up. But given the fact that we're starting a little bit late, I think we're going to go ahead and get going. On the agenda today, as with For All Groomings, is pouring through what's in the Sprint backlog and what's in progress, making sure that its associated metadata is still accurate, and then reprioritizing things in the queue based on our current understanding of the project status and health. I don't have a lot of metadata to update on that, and those of you who've been in more than one meeting with me now know that I tend to just talk and not have slides, which is why we have Eric usually. But I will try to be brief. In this last sprint, I have opened up an epic and created a lot of stories underneath that epic for the enablement of a real official and standardized release cycle for PWA Studio itself. I think this makes it easier for contributors, and it's sort of meta, but the contributors are already doing a great job. I can tell that we would have more contributors and that it would be easier for contributors to contribute if it was clear, for instance, what the actual requirements for a pull request are and what's just sort of optional. If it were clear how to run your code through linter and test and get informative output that is easy and quick to fix in your workflow. And I think it would be great if we understood how and when to release versions of the separate components of PWA Studio onto NPM so that they could be consumed. Jimmy observed, and several others observed, that we're not in production yet, as in there are not people depending on production published versions of this software in NPM. And that's true. That's a reason why this isn't a crazy emergency, but it's still very important. So I'm going to ask us to groom these stories because of their quantity, but I'm not going to demand that they be high priority. I just want them to fit into the other stuff that we're doing. Separately, we want to go over the sprint and identify some things that have taken a long time or some things that have been sort of off the schedule. You guys ready to go with that? Or does anyone have any initial comments?
Not just yet.
Okay, not just yet. You're formulating a comment, I can tell.
Stories first.
So let's first take a look at the Sprint stories and their current statuses in the pipeline. Presently for Sprint 22, we have left a couple of things in technical review that have carried over from Sprint 21. But when Eric returns, we will clone them according to his actual specific guidelines, which are not documented. But right now, PWA Dev Server is, as far as I know, not merged, though I have not checked this morning. Is it merged now?
Which one?
The PWA Dev Server optimization requests to make things optional that are often broken.
Don't think so. I think it's actually
still not. Okay, so it's still not closed. And if I look at it, okay, can you guys still see my screen?
No.
Okay. Share. Desktop one. I'll just share Chrome. Hopefully that'll do it. Okay, can you see that I'm scrolling through a pull request now?
Yeah.
Most excellent. So this is the story that the pull request that corresponds to story number 8, which incidentally I need to actually associate it, which I haven't done in my commentary. But this is an enablement piece to make the PWA dev server more resilient under situations where the host file method of creating a local host name is not possible or easy to do for whatever reason, or SSL provisioning is hard to do, or the local database that stores that information is in a strange state. So there's a slight refactor to remove some of the state and to make it all optional. There's a lot of documentation associated with it, and I fixed the error message for you, Jimmy. I don't know if there's more review comments that you have, but as you guys can see, I went ahead and identified a couple of other reviewers. Art, I identified you as a potential reviewer. Martin Hansen's not on, but he's a person who would be willing to do so. We just got a whole lot of new people who are interested in doing code reviews, so I'm hoping that they can come aboard as well. Matter of fact, I think I'll forward out the invite to them for next week's Grimming. But they weren't able to make this one. So I'm comfortable with just Jimmy's pull request review, but if there are any objections to me merging it upon his approval, or suggestions that maybe somebody else ought to review this sort of server-side code, I would accept that. But that would make this transition into done. So any objections to Jimmy and I handling that one ourselves, or do people want to intervene and perform their own code review? Because I would accept that. As a matter of fact, I would welcome it. That would be very gratifying, but that's okay.
Let's give it a few hours and we can merge it this afternoon.
That's what we'll do. Secondly, this is a story that needs to be re-implemented as an epic or re-tagged as an epic, because checkout MVP is involving several sprints and several sub-stories into that sprint. So that takes care of technical review. In progress for this sprint are mostly things to do with extensibility and documentation of the patterns that we're using. Mr. Kalkabin is doing Venia Global Styles documentation, and Jimothy, does this story still feel like a 3?
Yeah, I actually created a PR. I finished. I'm waiting for a review from Jimmy and Soumya.
Hey, fantastic. All right. Feel free to identify members of the community to do such a PR review as well. Now, I recognize we don't have a lot of UX people, but a lot of these folks can pinch hit. Like Rowan's right there. Rowan can do all the things. So feel free to name people in those PRs. So that suggests to me that midday today or tomorrow you will, well, I guess if you've opened a PR and there's feedback, then this gets moved to technical review, does it not?
Yeah, it should be in technical review.
Okay. For me, I'm implementing a middle tier reference architecture, which is going to be the full sprint, but is going to result in a node implementation of something that can respond to GET requests based on a declarative specification that can be implemented in multiple languages. And we'll talk about that more later, but it continues to be a 13. It's a stretch for the end of the sprint, especially considering the personal stuff. And Jimmy has already issued one pull request to make some preliminary changes for adding extensibility patterns to the Redux actions. And I think there are people on this call, I'm thinking Art and Rowan, who are very interested in what that looks like, how adding Redux behaviors, actions, reducers, etc., is going to feel to an extension developer or theme developer. So would you like to talk about that briefly?
Yeah, and so we're just getting started on that story, because I don't think in my research that's not a well-explored area of Redux, but it's something that Magento is probably going to be pushing boundaries on, which is to say Redux is generally thought of as like how your app state is structured, and you kind of build the whole, every slice of state is kind of built at first when the app first loads up. But since we're trying to make PWAs, and since we're trying to support modules doing extension that we basically don't know a whole lot about, they need to be able to asynchronously tap into the store and add a whole new slice of state, or listen to new, add new actions being responded to into current reducers. So we're going to be kind of putting a bunch of hooks into Redux state, and that is going to involve getting actions and reducers all kind of operating in the same way and having those same hooks. So we're getting started on that story now, basically.
It bears mentioning that this isn't completely beyond the pale for Redux, as Redux has introduced, as part of its public API, mutation methods for the store, and acknowledges in the documentation, like, hey, if you're doing progressive apps, this might be useful to you.
Right. So
it's not, I mean, it's unexplored territory in that you're building kind of a feature set, but it's not like against the grain.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're starting on that.
Gotcha. So if you could be fanciful for a little bit, I know that, like, for instance, in our mini cart component, we got mini cart, we got a component representing the view of that mini cart, and then the component in its component will mount method, it dynamically imports the reducer logic for it, which is a pattern that we know we're going to want to repeat. And when that reducer logic is done, it injects a slice into the reducer, and then at that point you need to wait for a full dispatch to occur so that the reducer can bind up its state according to the rest of the application state. Which seems like a couple of round trips, but in my experience is pretty fast. Does that sound like what we've got so far? And if not, what's different about it? If so, what's next?
No, what's more likely is that we will have an actual thing that resembles more of a pipeline.
Okay.
For one, for core stuff, but then that pattern that we've proved out in the mini cart will also be available for things that are really more off the cuff.
Okay.
If that makes sense, right? So
yeah,
we'll do a little bit more definition of core concepts for what a store has in terms of state, and then we'll leave the ability to do that kind of stuff that's happening in the mini cart.
Okay.
But we still need to have solutions for modifying reducers in flight. So
yeah, like they need to call out referenced implementations of things. Well, okay. Does this continue to be a 3 for you? It's starting to sound large.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, there's more work, but this story is just a 3, and so this is just going to be getting everything on the same page between the reducers. And and the actions. I mean.
Well, great. Thank you. Now we have a continued backlog for this sprint, including some UX design and components from Salmia, who is still at an Adobe Summit, and so we don't have an update from, but Salmia is a freight train. She will get this stuff done, and we will have it. So let's assume that it's okay and not in any risk.
Could I just jump back to the Redux stuff for a sec?
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to ask, it may not be the right place for it, but if there's the concept of adding a performance budget into that, so as extensions hook into it, that you are able to sort of track that cost or highlight heavy actions inside of there.
That's a very good point. That would be. Have you done anything around those implementations before? Have you seen particular problems that you have in mind when you're asking that?
Yeah, in terms of client-side implementations, Rowan, what sorts of performance budgets can you apply to patterns?
Especially to reduction functions and stuff.
Yeah, this is why I'm wondering. I mean, maybe we should take this discussion offline.
We do need to bring at least 2 stories or I'll feel bad.
Yeah, my specific questions would be, is this the right point to hook in looking at things like size of requests and the amount of time that the tasks are taking? Redux feels like the place where you would have that logging coming back,
yes.
At least in the development environment, to be able to sort of push this out to some kind of profiling information or integrate it into DevTools.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely, this is where we've started doing our first requests, is inside of Redux actions, right? The asynchronous actions that we're doing. And so while they are asynchronous, that doesn't, so they're not of course going to be blocking the calculation of the next app state. They are going to have all kinds of performance metrics that we can snatch in the process. And of course, we can pipe all actions through middleware to do that pretty consistently. So
can I ask you sorry.
Go ahead.
Rowan, can I ask you a kind of a specific dummy question about that?
Yeah.
In the interest of avoiding micro benchmarks, a few of the things that pop off the top of my mind for measuring the performance against prior iterations of something would be things like cyclomatic complexity, round trips to the network, round trips through the event loop. Some of those are obvious. Some of those seem like micro benchmarks. I'm wondering if there is a canonical list of things that, with regards to Lighthouse, are penalized. I mean, I feel like I know in theory how to make an application performant, but the question is, how do we make that a really easy API to use, and like what's the most important thing that still has to accomplish? like in
Yeah.
terms of metric?
I think some of the obvious ones are, I mean, even though a lot of this is async, anything that is resulting in blocking the UI thread is obviously something to track. And then just as well, the amount of time that is being spent in scripting there as well.
Right.
And I guess the bandwidth cost is another one.
Okay.
And certainly the highest level one is just the overall time for the call. But I guess you do want to draw a line between stuff that is environment dependent and stuff that can be more consistently measured against just the code rather than the environment.
Gotcha. So that's a question for offline, but amount of time spent in scripting is a trade-off that people don't think about enough, but yeah. Definitely worth continuing to talk about. Like, this seems like it might be our fundamental integration model, so it would be a great place to apply those performance budgets.
Noted.
Okay, so real quick, we've got some sneezes. So we were skipping to the sprint backlogs. Salmi is going to come through. Starting with Jimmy, if you still feel like your extensibility story is a 3, then that means you ought to be able to begin implementing editable shipping address for checkout either today or Monday.
Yeah, I mean, yesterday was, as we discussed, a wash because of the issues with the 165. So
Yeah.
I'll be trying to finish that up this week, and I'll be ready to go on 177 on Monday.
Okay. All right. And then Mr. Kalkman, the documentation for the middle tier architecture obviously is blocked, but I don't see it. Oh, no, I do see it as blocked. That's what that is. Excellent. So I understand that you're going to need to have middle tier architecture delivered in enough time. Since it's a 3, I figure you probably would like to have it by Monday or Tuesday.
Yeah, that would be ideal.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, and then for Art, you are implementing a product slider component. All right.
Yep.
So let's see. Right now it's budgeted as an 8, which means it would take the entire sprint, and we are halfway through the sprint. How are you feeling about that? And where did it go?
Okay, it is in progress, and no, another one. Yep. It is in progress. I checked GraphQL query from GraphQL teams. For quick view, looks okay. So every data that we need already there. So yep.
All right. And so it remains accurately scoped, you would estimate.
Yep.
Okay, awesome. So let's sort this pipeline by age. And milestone. No, that's not correct.
There's a newest and an oldest in that list.
Yeah, we can just do newest. I mean, it should be FIFO, so we could do oldest, but a lot of those things are just like show example URLs, create a development instance. What I think we ought to do is groom the newer ones. Yeah. Okay. So one thing that we did create before we get into my giant issue is CMS page component, CMS block component, payment request POC for checkout MVP. So, Jimmy, does your editable shipping address still does not involve any payment functionality? So right now, even though this is assigned to Andrew, I think that we can A, unassign it, and B, we can talk a little bit about what it would mean. So Art, and even Rowan too, based on your knowledge of payment requests, right now Magento expects to go through a particular procedure of submitting, hashed in several requests, payment information, and then for that payment to go through a gateway and return reference IDs, the usual stuff. Implementing payment request API, we are getting conflicting reports on it. Some say like there should be no API changes necessary. And some say that there should, and that there have to be in order for it to be secure or for it to even work. Rowan, as I understand it, the payment API was designed so that you don't need too much server-side change, but you do need some, right? It needs to be able to take the token.
Yep, press the wrong button there. Yeah, so your most basic implementation of it, if you're using the like basic card information, then your first pass at this is payment request is sort of programmatic access to autofill. So from that point of view, you can do payment request with very little in the way of changes to your flow or backend system. But yes, if you are retrieving a token, then you do need to be able to submit that token to your server. But again, that would be the kind of, if you are already processing tokenized payment methods, then you may have an endpoint, or you may simply be able to expose something that can process that.
Okay. It's for building a payment request chiefly, not for actually authing it and debiting it.
If you're just building it, then that should be primarily client side, I should think.
Okay. So that means basically it's basically a fancy mapper, because our quote has a particular object structure and it has pretty much everything you would need to create a payment request. It's got the shipping address, et cetera, et cetera. So what we're talking about is something that translates the quote object, maps a quote object onto a payment request initializer. Does that sound accurate?
I think what you'll want to do here is think of payment request as a way of gathering these saved details from the user. So for example, primarily you're gathering like a saved card, but it can also do things like a supplier saved email address, a supplier saved shipping address. Depending, given the sort of configurable nature of Magento, I would suspect that you would want to set up a payment request to be, in this instance, configurable to say, no, on this flow, I've got a saved shipping address within Magento, so I'm not going to ask for shipping address from payment request, that kind of configuration.
Okay. Implementation of shipping address is still necessary for us just because of our mission involves covering more than payment request, but we also know that payment request helps us to MVP pretty fast. And Jimmy, this is work that you have not yet done.
Right.
So would you feel comfortable at least exploring the delegation of the actual UI for filling out this shipping address down to payment request, and then using payment request to export the object once the users fill it out, and then translate it back into the quote, and then that's how we'll slowly like zip pay a payment request in?
Yeah, I mean, the UI work to do that should be really minimal because it's already driven by Redux. So,
okay,
like you would have to make a button that launched the payment request, and then when you received it, you would literally just have to basically skip a few steps in the flow, and the UI is basically already set up to respond appropriately to that.
So make shipping request replace address entry form is pretty small. How would you estimate it?
Estimate which?
The work to replace, so initially, again, looking at your implement editable shipping address for checkout.
Yep.
Right now, the way that that's scoped is
because I'm making fields and stuff.
Yeah, it's making
not part of a payment request UI, right? Payment request has its own UI on the device, right?
Right. So if you did this as payment request, it would mean less work doing the styling and the creation of the fields, but more work obviously interacting with payment request, writing mappers, figuring out how.
Yeah, it's like a it's like a 3 in terms of work other than dealing with payment request itself, which I have literally no idea what that involves.
Okay. We're going to need an editable form anyway, and given the way that our resources are distributed, I'm not going to exhort you to do this with payment request instead. But I do think that we need to add another issue for implement payment request driven shipping address for checkout, and we need to call it a 3, and we need to put it in the backlog. What do you think of that?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, I'm going to do my cool thing where I clone a GitHub issue way better than Eric does it.
Okay, and while you do that, I'll talk a bit about where I'm headed with my own resource time, right? So we can think about it, right?
Yes, please.
So the things that are still outstanding to do, right, are number one, we have to get some form fields set up so that we could make a bunch of forms that need to happen here.
Yes.
Including like my account, and then eventually auth forms and stuff. So I need to do some field work to get that set up, and that's really what this editable shipping address story is all about. And then beyond that, right, as soon as we're done with kind of the MVP of checkout, I'm going to be trying to get auth going, so that people can make an account.
Gotcha. Okay.
And once that's done, we're going to be a lot closer to, the earliest releases of this. And so the next story is really going to be about finishing out all of these different facets of extension.
Right.
Which I'm kind of working on at the same time. So.
Okay. As a shopper, I want to use my device's native personal information entry fields when creating and checking out and completing a purchase in a PWA online store so that I can feel more trust about the route and storage of that information. Expected result, I would say that in presence of payment request runtime, HTML shipping address field hides and is replaced by a launcher to payment, request API. Passive voice, but what are you going to do? Data the user enters into the payment pre-populates in the quote. It's not pre-populates. Into the quote. All right. So it goes there. Implement payment request powered shipping address entry at checkout and submitted. So I'm not going to assign this to you necessarily, but it's there in the backlog, and that's one story. And also, I completely forgot to scope it because I'm the coolest.
Sorry, we can come back and scope it. So
yeah, I mean, we're close to
5 minutes on the call, so let's try and
5 minutes on the call.
get a couple more stories, and then we're good.
Okay, so Eric made this, and then this actually goes under this. And okay. All right. So that will go in, I would say, you said it was a 3? I'm inclined to say it's a 5.
Okay.
Other suggestions? Mr. Kalkovin, Art, Rowan, given our velocity of 5 is the majority of the sprint to do this?
Like I said, the 3 is just doing the UI.
Yep.
Right. The trick is that you also have to learn how payment request works and interact with that. So
Okay.
Yeah, I'd err on the side of a 5 here because you always run into difficulties in like mapping one set of data to the other and ensuring that the process payment request is providing for you does actually drop into the checkout process easily.
Rowan, do you ever use any JSON transformation or query DSLs like in any of the production tools that you've seen?
I haven't, but I can always look around if there's something you are specifically interested in.
Well, there's a bunch of competing ones, but the question for me is more general, which is like a good cross-platform way of munging data, like XSLT, but not XSLT.
I'll actually ping me on Slack afterwards, as we
Sure.
have been playing with something on the moving between client, service worker, and server side that
Yeah.
might be useful there.
Yeah, I have this cycle in mind. JSON path is the one that people seem to use the most. It's just XPath for JSON, missing some XPath features. JSON path through GraphQL, through JSON path through GraphQL, orchestrated out to parallel, back to singular where necessary, all through a YML file, and then out to a template, which then has a partial for delegating out to another server socket or process. So app shells. I'll talk to you about that offline. All right. So so we've created one story. I mean, I think that we're short on time. We're done on time, I guess. But are there any other stories that you guys were very, very interested in? I'm going to assign this to Jimmy provisionally. Actually, I'm just going to unassign independent. Are there any stories that you guys were interested in sort of re-examining?
not at this time, I think.
Okay. Well, it's not the most absolutely productive grooming, but it is a clear and friendly and nice one. Thank you guys all for coming. Okay.
Thanks for hosting.
We'll be in touch over Slack. Say hi to Paul and the rest of the team from the Canadian company whose name I forget now. They'll jump in. They've got Docker containers and everything, which is super fun. All right.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much, folks.
Yep.
Bye-bye.